I'm from London, Ontario, and people in London always get mad at me because I call it a small town, even though it's 400,000 people. So don't tell them I said this. But really, when I think about the civic tech movement and digital government at large, we don't hear about cities like London, much less cities and towns that are smaller than London. I mean, 400,000 is a sizable amount of people. What about people who don't have that? And I'm really excited that we get to explore that today. If we want this civic tech and digital government movement to be what we say, welcoming, inclusive, truly encompassing of all the people in the movement, then we need to break down this big city dominance. Right? We need to start thinking about when the next Code for Canada Summit is going to be happening in the Northwest Territories, right? Like really thinking about what does it mean to be outside of the big cities. And our movement only thrives with a diversity of perspectives, but also not just a diversity of perspectives, but a true recognition of what it means to only have a few voices represented in the group. So today we're going to explore a little bit about what it means to have different voices represented, particularly voices outside of these big cities. So I'm really, really excited for our panel today. We're going to hear from our panelists, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So please keep your questions in mind. We're going to make sure that they're able to answer them at the end. We're going to leave a lot of time for that. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question in front of the group, scribble it down and just pass it up to me. I'm happy to ask it on your behalf. Happy to do that. And then I'm going to get off the stage because you don't need to hear from me anymore. You need to hear from the people who are actually doing this work outside of the big cities. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to jump right into Ashleigh. And as you know, we've been looking at Ashleigh. Ashleigh Weeden, her pronouns are she and her. She's a PhD candidate, a researcher, and a sessional lecturer at the University of Guelph. And she's dedicated her entire career to the fascinating stories of rural communities and the people that call them home. She's an award-winning innovator and a community mobilizer. And Ashleigh is pursuing her PhD in rural studies at the University of Guelph, where she's focused on researching place-based rural innovation, community capacity building, and public policy renewal. I'm going to toss to Ashleigh, and then I'll introduce Mark after that. So Ashleigh, all yours.
Hi everyone, and hello from definitely a small town. I'm in central Wellington, Ontario, which is just outside of Guelph. I'm sure that I can present remotely, and that my rural broadband so far is hanging out. So bear with me if I turn into a bit of a robot for a couple seconds through the talk. Just kind of muddle along with me as we go, and then also I so appreciate everyone's help for getting this set up remotely. So happy to be here. I'm just going to share my slides. So give me 1 second, and I'll get rolling with what I planned to share for this morning. So also, I can't see you, but you can see me. So this is a really interesting conversation. I'm talking into the void, but it's nice to hear voices on the other side. I'm going to share a little bit today about not just some of my perspective from my PhD research, which you heard Samir talk a little bit about, but also my previous experience in working in local government. So I spent the first decade of my career, I sometimes call myself a recovering public servant. I spent the first decade in local government, municipal government primarily, leading community transformation projects, whether that had to do with community engagement and getting people to care about fundamentally unsexy topics like municipal budgets, or whether that was talking about what our future was going to look like. And so I want to share a few of the lessons learned from about a decade of trying to lead this work outside of urban environments, primarily from my perspective at the municipal side. So I know you guys are all in Toronto right now, and I hope you can see my slides and this is all working, but I just want to remind you that where you are right now is not the center of the universe, despite all the feelings contrary. And neither is Ottawa. It was interesting to hear Samir note that I sort of talk about Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, all of these major areas as if that's the whole entire substance of what makes Canada Canada. And
about 5 members, but now we're at...
And I think that this is to a tremendous disservice. However, despite people sort of having a growing recognition, maybe that there is a world outside of these larger cities, we still fundamentally write policy and programming and investment initiatives as if everywhere is the same. So while we understand fundamentally that Toronto would be different than Barcelona, would be different from Amsterdam, we seem to have a flattening effect when we think about rural and remote places. And in fact, actually, this is the panel that we're on this morning is a really great example sometimes of how we do that, which is rural, remote, and First Nations often get grouped together into one long run-on sentence, as if they're all the same, as if there are not multiple kinds of rurality, multiple kinds of North, multiple First Nations within our borders. So I think that it's a really important context, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my perspective as being very much on the outside of that, but certainly within still the interesting part of Southern Ontario that also sometimes thinks of itself as the only engine within the country, and we know that's not the case. But for me, this was the center of the universe for most of the last 5 years, and still remains to a large extent. And I'm not sure to the degree to which these are showing up, but that's a heart around the center of Grey County in Ontario. So for those who are not familiar with some of the geography of the area, Grey County and largely Grey Bruce have been my home for much of my life, and Grey is just in that area between Owen Sound and Blue Mountains, off towards kind of the base of the Georgian Bay, just before you start heading around the corner up into Muskoka. And my perspective of what the center of the universe looked like is all contextual. And I think that this is a really important remembrance when we talk about digital transformation, is that what's periphery and what's remote or rural depends largely on where your center of the universe is. I've just come back from about 4 months in the United Kingdom doing field work for my dissertation in Northern Scotland. And one of the interesting conversations there about how we define these issues and why there isn't a uniform definition of what rural or periphery might be is that, for example, in the United Kingdom, England has to deal with a rural context that's in relationship to London, and Scotland has to deal with a rural context that's in relationship to the Shetland Islands. And if you're certainly located outside of any of those areas, my sense is often that if you live in Pickle Lake in Ontario, if you live in Markdale, if you live in Nelson, BC, and someone tells you that you're remote, or that you're rural, or that you're periphery, my first reaction is often, according to who? I might be rural, I might be remote compared to your context being in Toronto or Vancouver, but I certainly am not remote or removed when it comes to my experience with other people and my communities. So all of this is just an important reminder that place matters, and our context really matters in terms of how we frame digital transformation. And we also don't have to ask ourselves anymore, like, can we do these things? Can we do these projects in rural context? We have to ask ourselves, what is it that we actually want to do? And one of the reasons I'm presenting remotely this morning, due to some of the increased risks associated with COVID-19, is that all of these issues around what can we do and what we want to do are also based on what we've done before. A lot of the current recommendations, and just to make things kind of very, very contextualized and current for those in the room, the advice to work from home, to conduct classes online, to deliver services remotely or online as much as possible, have huge implications in large parts of the country where I'm just holding out hope that this connection stays true. But in a lot of cases, after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's not even worth it for me to turn my computer on, because once everybody gets home from school, my bandwidth goes down to about 2.5 megs down and maybe 0.3 up. And that means that functionally anything that I want to do on the internet cannot really be done. This is also a really important topic when we start talking about digital by default for governments, that we really need to be careful about who it is that we're thinking of in this regard. Do people have the basic infrastructure required to facilitate these things? On the flip side, there's a lot of interesting innovation that's happened, not despite rurality, but because of rurality. And I'm thinking of things that will increasingly become important over the coming months as we deal with a spreading recognition of COVID-19 becoming a pandemic, is that virtual medicine and telemedicine, remote paramedic services, all of these issues were innovations that largely came about because of remoteness and rurality, not despite it. And they're actually being deployed in urban settings now, but are rural innovation. So what did we actually do in Grey County? What did I do when I was up there for 10 years building what I like to call the connected county, or working with people to tell different stories about what's happening in rural Canada? So During this time, I had the great fortune to be part of two major initiatives at the same time. I was responsible for community engagement for the Southwest Integrated Fiber Technology Initiative, which is Canada's largest publicly funded regional broadband initiative to date. It covers approximately 10% of the Canadian population across 44,000 square kilometers in Ontario, running from Windsor to Orillia, and kind of largely Goderich to Caledon, and then the Niagara region. Within that territory, there were 14 First Nations, and as I said before, more than 10% of the Canadian population across a footprint largely 9 times the size of Prince Edward Island. So quite a huge initiative, and largely aimed at investing in enabling the infrastructure required to connect people. This represents a huge shift in the way that we were trying to do business, and honestly, from the start of that project in 2012 until its actual shovels in the ground this year, and I'm no longer with the project, I left to go back to school, but it took the better part of 5 to 7 years to actually see this come to action, and most of that had to do with people not recognizing that we could treat internet infrastructure like a public utility, and that it should be governed and considered as something that requires significant public stewardship. We also connected this locally with what we were doing in Grey County around the Connected County project, which was really about understanding that if we wanted to move forward into what it meant to be a rural region in the future, this wasn't just about putting Cat5 cables and everything or getting infrastructure in the ground. It was really trying to figure out what it is, as I said before, what it is that we wanted to do. And so combined, we were really about building the infrastructure required as a basic level of connecting people, but then also trying to figure out what was already happening and leaning into those assets. The idea being here that we could build something that was scalable, adaptable, and holistic, and based on the needs of our community, as well as tell a different story to policymakers that were directing investments in our community. As I said before, it's not fast work. The Western Ontario Wardens Caucus in Grey County started pursuing an unspecified broadband project in 2012, and it took 5 years of constantly reminding people that this was an important initiative until we were finally recognized by the Intelligent Community Forum as a top 7 community in 2017. The Intelligent Community Forum is a think tank based out of New York. They have a Canadian chapter as well, and they are a global competition for hundreds and hundreds of cities across the world that essentially tried to benchmark themselves into how are we thinking about the future and the way we work now. It's a model that allows for thinking about a holistic way of developing not just a smart city, which has all kinds of inherent problems which we're already dealing with, I think, and I know that there's folks in the room and at the summit today that are raising all kinds of questions about that. So then how do we move beyond into a different concept? And I'll share a little bit about that model in a couple minutes. Something else to note is that we tried very hard to participate in a regional project driven by the Southwest Economic Alliance, which is no longer actually a body in Southwestern Ontario. And it was designed to try and move between the two. How do we facilitate infrastructure investments and economic and social development on a regional basis? And the biggest challenges related to that was getting people to think differently about how we work together as local governments. There's a lot of lip service paid to municipal governments being the order of government closest to Canadians and having a significant amount of impact. But when it comes right down to it in terms of how we invest in policy and programming, so we still behave as if municipalities can't make their own decisions and can't figure out ways to work together, which is fundamentally not true. The biggest barriers to actually implementing a lot of these projects often come from people outside of our region and at other orders of government recognizing the value in what's already going on and trying to tell us how to fix ourselves. Rural is not broken. I'm so tired of urbanists coming in and telling us that we're doing it wrong when they just don't understand our context. So if we're talking about telling a different story, it's really time for a lot of decision makers to listen to what's already happening in rural and remote areas of Canada. So the Intelligent Community Forum model, and it's based on 6 key pillars, and I think that they're actually not pillars, they're interwoven in a feedback loop. So those arrows that head in one direction quite as easily just go in the other. And this is based on the idea that your broadband infrastructure isn't the only thing, and we talk a little bit about that right now. We have 8 almost 9, I guess now with the most recent one, federal broadband initiatives across Canada that are seeking to connect our communities. And we've had very limited success on actually moving the bar. And I think a lot of that has to do with if we invest in just a minimal amount of the infrastructure, we think that's going to be enough. And what the Intelligent Community Model Forum actually really promises, and what gave us a lot of power on the ground in Grey County, was looking at these other examples, which is how are we supporting a resilient workforce that can transition as economies shift? How are we looking at digital transformation as something that doesn't leave people behind? As a rising tide should float all boats, it was really important that we pursued something that considered the social aspects of what we were up to. And then the engagement side around everybody's got to be on the bus. This isn't something that people can look to the government or look to municipal affairs or look to other orders of government and other actors and say, this is your responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility to get on the boat. The sustainability aspect is relatively new in the last few years, and that's really this recognition that we only have one planet and we have to behave accordingly. As we start thinking about technological responsibility, a big effort is looking at these things. And I'd just like to pause here and say that a lot of our notions around rural development in Canada still focus on a strip it and ship it model. So we look at rural areas and remote regions as places that are energy producers, food producers, carbon sinks, or wastelands. And I'd really like to pause, and if you take one thing away from today is to remember that rural places are whole communities and context in and of themselves. Yes, farmers feed cities, but we also exist for whole other reasons. And we have to really start considering around this notion of what the right to rurality means for our communities. And the last bit around this, and I think that we've inverted this sort of 6-figure circle to think that innovation is also something around how do we help each other do what we do best, and is recognizing each player has a strength to bring to the table. But this model kind of flips that on its end, right? We're not saying innovation and connectivity are the only things that drive this. It's around how do all these factors work together. And in Grey, we really built a project around these models that wasn't trying to do anything fundamentally different, but was telling a different story about the people that were already driving things forward. The most useful lesson I can share from that is that we can't be prophets in our own hometown. And it wasn't until I started talking to people in Toronto or via the CBC or via other mediums about all of the great things that people in Grey County were already doing that people started to galvanize around this project. They had to see themselves in the story being told to other people in order to recognize that what they were doing was of value and innovative and interesting. And I think that tells us a lot about our current conceptualization of rural development and rural innovation. In that vein, I believe that the future is place-based. So all of these initiatives, all of this practical case study work, and you can find out a lot more about the nitty-gritty details of what it was we did in Grey County by going to the case on the Intelligent Communities Forum website, which is, I believe, newcommunities.org, or by reaching out to the folks at Grey, is that the future really has to account for all of these issues. We have spatial requirements that need to actually be dealt with in terms of managing distance, managing just the sheer geography of Canada and what that looks like, as well as interesting mechanisms around how we invest in these programs. If you assume that the cost of building fiber in Toronto is going to be the same as building fiber in northern Manitoba, where you have to actually freeze muskeg in order to get equipment out and build infrastructure, then your assumptions about the funding required and the models that are going to be necessary to move these things forward are grossly underestimating the impacts of these programs. And we distribute funding kind of based on that idea. Instead, we really need to start thinking about these spatial contexts. Also critical to this is the idea of identity. I'm not someone that could ever or would ever want to live in a major urban center, and I've spent my career dedicated to the places that I love. And just as I respect that everyone who loves their urban environment is quite passionate about what an urban future looks like, it's really important to recognize that each rural community has its own identity as well as the people that live there, and they layer on top of each other's, and they're just as valid. And finally, this idea of context and networks, and I think this is going to become increasingly interesting to look at as we think about what's going to be coming down the line globally in terms of climate, in terms of disease in the immediate future, and in terms of how we want to build our relationships to each other. is that nothing exists out of isolation. This isn't about rural versus urban. This is about how we exist in conversation to each other. And that place is never in isolation. It's always in that linkage around how we talk to each other. The Connected County story was really about how do we put this in play around our context as Western Ontario, our context with each other, and what those lessons look like in order to say, look, we're all in a relationship to each other and to this place, and here's what that looks like in real life. It was really exciting to work on these projects, but led me back to my PhD, and I'm keen to talk a little bit more later if folks have questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. I'm findable online, even though I'm not there in the room, so please reach out. I'd love to share more specifics about what it is that we've done and what it is that we're hoping to do in the future, but those are the ways that you can find me, and I look forward to hearing more from the rest of the folks on the panel. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you can still see me. There we go, hello. And I turn it over to you, Samir.
Thanks so much, Ashleigh, really appreciate it. Thank you, Ashleigh. We're going to just switch over to Mark's slides, so we're not going to see your face for a little bit, so if you need to duck out or something, feel free to. We'll come back to you during the Q&A. I am very excited now to introduce Mark Burns, who's the founding director of the E-Services for Citizens branch within the government of Yukon. And that branch has a mandate to make services more available in the public digital channel. So they're really working hard on what it looks like to deliver digital service in government in Yukon. He is also the current co-chair of the Public Sector Service Delivery Council, and we're very excited to have him here to talk to us about what they're doing up there.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about government outside of major cities. The entire Yukon's outside of major cities. So I'm going to give a little bit of context what it's like to be in the Yukon. We're going to talk a little bit about E-Services for Citizens, the branch. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about open source, and then some actual projects in progress. Is there a way to make the tiny little thumbnail here? I can't actually see my own slides here. I'll tell you what, I'll read it off here. So the first thing I want to talk about is population density. And so here, the first number here, you can see, about 4 people per square kilometer, national average in Canada. Here in Ontario, about 14 people per square kilometer. Get up to the Yukon, 0.01 people per square kilometer. So very, very low population density, large area, a few people scattered over that. Population about 36,000 people, about 75% of those people live in Whitehorse. So once you get outside of Whitehorse, a big city, town, municipality, it's like 1,500 people, and then from there you're into the hundreds very quickly. So when we talk about context, and when in Whitehorse, we refer to those places as the communities. And Whitehorse is the center of everything, but of course on the national scale, Whitehorse is tiny. It's like a large university, right? Other sort of challenges there are the community is quite small, so it's neat because you know everybody, everyone's very practical and very solutions focused, but there's just not. You're not going to get a room with this many people together to talk about this stuff in the north. The limited cell and fiber connectivity issue. There's one fiber conduit that runs south from Whitehorse, and a few times a year it gets knocked out, some on the backhoe, digging something up. Next thing you know, one time I believe it was disconnected because it was trampled by bison. The fiber came to the surface of the earth and a herd was moving through there, and so they had some problems with it. They're currently building a second fiber north up the Dempster to Inuvik that will meet up with the Northwest Territories fiber through the Mac Valley. We'll actually have this giant redundant ring. That, for the first time, will open up the possibility of actually putting mission-critical stuff in the cloud. Because right now, if we put our website in the cloud and something happens to the fiber, like let's suppose the dam breaks, all the information about the dam break would be on the other side of the fiber cut. So that would be a problem, right? You'd lose your website. So we have to keep a lot of this stuff locally until that second fiber is built. And then that opens up moving into things like AWS and Azure. So I'm going to move on here and talk a little bit about E-Services for Citizens, the branch. So it was set up in 2014. And I was the first employee. They had this idea that we should have some people who know something about providing services to citizens in the digital channel. And that was pretty much the whole mandate at that point. There was no strategy, there wasn't a real vision. So that was job one, is to figure out what is this thing going to be, and what value is it going to create for citizens, for the government, and for the staff and facilities of the Yukon. So we started off with these four first mandates, which was to produce the platforms for web publishing, so making information available to the public online. Second is sort of the bread and butter of all digital service delivery organizations, which is the interactive services, the ability of citizens to interact with the government to get things like fishing licenses and camping permits and renew their motor vehicle stickers and all this kind of stuff. So the actual interaction with government is the second piece that we spend a lot of time on. The next two, citizen engagement and open data. So citizen engagement, the idea that citizens should have opportunity to participate in the process of governance, and we should be providing tools that make that an easy thing, accessible, especially over massive distances of places that are difficult to travel, for example, to go to town hall meetings. You'd want to make that as efficient and easy as possible so people don't need to leave the communities to travel to a central place like Whitehorse to have these kinds of interactions. So the citizen engagement platform, our open data now evolving into our open government platform, which is the concept that the government's data resources are really the citizens' data resources, and we should make those available to the citizens for pretty much whatever use they want, and that should be easy and convenient. So that's our open data program. Other things that are also in e-services for citizen branch include the spatial infrastructure. So all the elevation data, all the Earth surface data, all the satellite imagery. And so that gives us the opportunity to combine spatial capabilities with service delivery. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion. And then the last three things here came to our group just recently. And I think the most important one here is forms. So forms was a separate group within Yukon government that lived within another group called Queen's Printer. And they moved forms. So every form, every official form of the government, which was primarily a PDF paper-based kind of system, has been moved into e-services for citizens. So to me, that's quite a statement about what the future looks like for service delivery to citizens when you move all of your forms management into the digital space to be addressed. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our affinity for open source and some of the spaces that we've played in. So we use a mix of Drupal 7 and 8. We're evolving to 8. We can still have some stuff on 7 for our web content management system, so publishing stuff online. It's also the main interface for our interactive service delivery. We also use a thing called DCAN, which is an open source data portal for all our open government. We have ATIP legislation, which compels the government to proactively publish stuff. That all goes into the open government portal, which is based on open source. And then the last one here is, recently you may have heard about the end of prohibition in Canada with relationship to cannabis. So we built a cannabis store based on Drupal Commerce, which of course is also open source. I've listed down here some of the reasons that we really like open source as a government operator, which is to say, we talked about hacking this morning, the bureaucracy. One of the nice things about open source is anyone on my team can go download it and install it in a sandbox and start to experiment with it. And the key here is you're not entering into a commercial relationship with anyone, which means you don't have to go through the whole procurement process. If we have this idea of something, we can find an open source code base, we can install it, we can start to experiment, we can build a prototype, we can start showing it around, we can start getting feedback, and we can do all of that before having to go into the procurement process to find somebody to sell us this stuff. So that is one of the top reasons we really enjoy using open source, is because it gives us the flexibility to innovate while not getting caught up in a lot of the bureaucracy. The next piece is, because it's open, and because open source is designed as open, it tends to play better in a multi-vendor environment. Governments tend to have systems of a wide range of vintages, and when you start to try and integrate these things and get one system to talk to another system, the open architecture of most open source projects becomes very helpful. Most vendors want you to join their ecosystem. They say, oh, just buy all our products, it'll all work wonderfully together. But the truth is, in government, you're going to have a wide range of systems that you're going to try and connect to. We've had better luck with open source on that mission than a lot of proprietary proprietary software. And then the final piece there, of course, is anything that the government must have in terms of features, we can build ourselves if they're missing. Quite often, when you look at an open source project, it's often built from through a commercial lens or an enterprise lens, and we're saying now we're going to use it in the public sector. We now need to tweak it a little bit to fit our needs, and the opportunities to do that in open source tend to be the best. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call our Supermini case studies, which are really some observations. I know everybody in this room suffers with talent. Trying to find the right people to work on your projects is very tough. It's a little bit more tough in the top left-hand corner of the country. For example, there isn't a university. Yukon College is on its journey to become a university. The legislation has been passed, that journey started, and that's going to happen, and that's going to help. That's coming. The ecosystem there is really excellent, but it also has limited capacity. When the Yukon government has a lot of projects, and just the regular purchasing cycle of government, the fiscal year, we can sometimes be pushing too much work. And so it's this kind of feast or famine where it gets really spiky for our entrepreneurs that are trying to help us, but then all of a sudden we want everything, and then we want nothing, and then we want everything. And it's really difficult for them to meet the capacity spikes. So what that means is we typically partner for a lot of the talent. We use our local vendors where we can, and when we need specialized talent, we partner with that. One of the things we've learned is you can never, ever, ever outsource or contract your strategy and your vision. You need to own that. You need to have somebody on your team who's accountable for that, and then you can hire almost everybody else. But you need to make sure that you own your own strategy. That's an important element of collaborating with partners, so you can be really clear about what you're trying to accomplish. The next piece here is economies of scale. In these very small population centers, economies of scale, vendors will come in and they'll give us a pitch and they're like, oh, we can support millions of people, millions of transactions an hour, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, this is not good for us. When we talk about scale, we want to know how you can scale this thing down to fit our population base. And that, the Oracle's like, what are you saying right now? So this becomes an issue, and it becomes important then for the Yukon government to aggregate as much of the transactions, as much of the work onto single platforms as we can, and find as many use cases and build a platform and use that to try and get up onto the efficient part of these economy of scale curves. And then the last piece here is, again, small population, finding thought leaders, finding people you can partner with to carry the message, to give it credibility in the communities, is always a challenge. One person can make a huge impact in a small population base, but the lack of that one person can also kind of work the other way. All right, let's talk a little bit about some specific examples of stuff we've done with open source and some of our experiences with it. So the first one here is yukon.ca. This is the main website for the Yukon government. We went through a bit of a rebuild. We're still in the middle of migrating all our content to it. You'll find that this was really our first platform play, especially with open source, and really sort of set up our model for bringing platforms and open source to the Yukon. And the thing that was the big shift here is that it really empowered departments to publish their own material without relying on IT to take their material and put it on the web for them. And just that little change was a bit of a flip in terms of how we work together. But it was the one that started the ball rolling. We talked a little bit in the earlier slides about the interactive services. So this interactive service is called Class 1 notification. So if you are a miner and you're looking to do some exploration, very early stage exploration, we're talking sort of like a 10-person camp with some fuel and some non-permanent structures, non-permanent roads, those kinds of things, you need to file one of these things called a Class 1 notification. Class 1 notification says, hey, we're going to do this on the land, you fill out this form. The thing that's interesting about this is in the Yukon, we have government-to-government relationships with First Nations, and when this activity happens on traditional territory of First Nations, they of course participate in that process. In the past, when it was a paper/human-based process, not all of that paperwork got to the right people in the right time frame. So by automating this, by having stakeholders register sort of as the person of record for these issues, when someone files a Class 1 notification, they will automatically be notified. Here's a link, go take a look at the notice, decide what you want to do about it, approve, etc. The other thing we did with this service, which I thought was interesting, is taking an educational approach to providing the service. So as you work your way through the form, there's a section there about how many liters of fuel you're going to store on the site. And if you have above the threshold, you're actually into a different set of regulations. It's no longer a Class 1. In the old days, of course, you'd fill out your piece of paper and you'd take a guess and write in a number, and then that piece of paper would go into the bureaucracy, and hopefully, if that number was out of range, a human would catch that, maybe call you up and say, well, we got to talk about this. Now, of course, we have air trapping built into the form. When you put the wrong number in there, or a number that exceeds the threshold, you'll, of course, get a message saying this exceeds the threshold. But it also explains now, perhaps this is Class 2 or Class 3 type of notification, and maybe you should be filing a different notification, or perhaps you should be lowering the amount of fuel you want to have in order to keep this as a Class 1. So you're actually educating people about the regulation. The other thing we did here, we talked about the connecting with the geospatial resources. In this case, we do a lookup, so depending on where the claim is located, we can figure out which First Nation governments need to be notified, and that's what generates the notice back to our partners. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is our experience using open source for our cannabis store. So we're getting into the cannabis business, which was a thing for government if you were around at that time. And the thing that was interesting is there was a lot of media coverage, and all the regulations and the policies about how to handle cannabis were changing. Not just how to sell it and the rules around selling it, but also enforcement, policing, social services. All these policies are being updated to accommodate this end of prohibition around cannabis. So here's a couple of things. One, no commerce platform that we looked at had this thing called an equivalency weight. So the equivalency weight, we didn't want to sell more cannabis to others than they were legally allowed to have. So what we wanted to do was keep track in the cart not only of the number of products you have and what that's going to cost you, but also how much cannabis equivalency weight you have. And oil and flour actually come in different ratios, so there's a bit of a lookup there depending on the products that are in your basket at the time. So that's one piece. That feature didn't exist. We were able to build it and include it into the store functionality. The other piece that this project really highlighted was this vendor lock-in avoidance. So in the media, you may recall, there was all kinds of stories about the immense amount of money that different jurisdictions were spending to get into the cannabis business. And our vendor from one of our standing offer agreements came to us and said, you know, we'll help you get into this business, and here's the number. And the number was too big. And we said, this number is too big for us. And they said, oh, the number's the number, you know, time's ticking, what do you want to do about this? And so we said, we'll take a pass. And here's the thing, we were able to go and find another vendor to provide the professional services to turn up this store without throwing away any of our technology. We had already installed Drupal Commerce on our servers. We had already started the work of securing the firewall, setting up VPN access, all these kinds of things were already in motion because we were doing this all as parallel. If we had used a proprietary vendor and they said, well, fine, if you don't want to work with us, we're leaving, we're taking all our stuff with us, we wouldn't have made the deadline. But because all our technology was safe from the vendor, our initial vendor not working with us, we were able to continue the project. A week later, we had a different vendor doing the development and finish the thing on time and launch the date that cannabis became legal in Canada. So I'm not going to say that open source eliminates vendor lock-in, but it sure changes the power balance in that relationship. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm out of time, I'm out of slides, but I'm not out of stuff to say. So if you want to talk about it, catch up with me. If you want to talk about the Yukon, if you want to talk about any of our projects, or if you want to talk about the pile of jobs I'm posting, catch up with me. I'd love to talk about it.
Ashleigh, you're back, so we can see you again. Great. I have 100 questions to ask, but I'm not going to monopolize the time because I know there are quite a few questions in the room. If you could raise your hand, say your name, your pronouns, and then who the question is, who you're asking the question to, so that Ashleigh can hear that as well. That would be great. I'm opening it up, and if no one has questions, I'm happy to go on for the next hour. So, anything from the room right now? we got right here. Yeah, please.
I am Janet Rombus, speaker. It's not exactly on topic of rural, but I was very intrigued by one of the opening remarks regarding open data. And that because the data belongs to the citizens, they should be free to use it for whatever they want to. I don't know if you even care at that government level, because we're a little bit quasi-government. I can explain that afterwards with more context. But what do you do to protect that for the citizens, but against commercialization? So, entities that would come in and take advantage of that open data and commercialize it.
So I can speak to that. First of all, just to be really clear about open data, it never includes any personal or private information.
Right.
Its data sets is never personal stuff, so just right off the top. But this idea that someone might come in and then commercialize this government data, absolutely. This is a resource to be used for commercialization. If you want to take this data and build an app that contextualizes it for people, it says, here's the nearest government office, and somebody wants to build an app. Like, we've been commercializing government data for a long time. Think of all the weather apps. There are all these weather apps. Most of the weather data actually comes from government-owned satellites, and then it gets commercialized, right? So open data is one of the purposes is to increase transparency, but one of the other purposes is to drive economic innovation. So we're perfectly fine with corporations, individuals, whoever, taking that data and commercializing. It's a resource for everyone to use in that regard.
Our situation is we're quasi-government in that we're not-for-profit, which means that we can, in order to offset the levies that we charge to the municipalities, we can generate revenue off of our data. So we continue to be pressured to get involved with the open data, but our problem with that, or the risk, is that if it becomes commercialized, then we're almost shooting the municipalities in the foot by the fact that we're not able to offset the levies by keeping that commercialization to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, just to be clear, not every piece of government data becomes open data. Open data is a license, and you apply that license. For example, all our satellite imagery, we don't have the right to give away. It's not ours, so we can't make it open data, even though we do make it available on our website. Our license allows us to do that. Our business model is, as a government, we have already collected the taxes, we've already generated this data, we now want to make that available to the public that paid for it. In a different model, where your business model is actually collecting data and selling it back, that's a different model, not open data, but it is a legitimate approach to doing it. As a public sector player, we're making the resource available as open, but it doesn't mean everybody has to do that. Although I will say the expectations around that information wants to be free, is definitely a trend.
Got a question? Ashleigh, yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. The challenges we would really, I would say one of the examples of what we did in Great Plains, we worked with trying to manage that exact question. So it started with the data consortium project for various counties, involving many of our social service sectors and our corporate around labor market demographics and all of those things. It became an open data project that operated along the continuum. So we were involved in exactly sort of managing those exact kind of questions around what data are we managing, purchasing, what's being sold back to us, what's being available on a regional basis. And that was actually a really important thing, and something that may be worth considering if you're working with rural and remote partners, is the ability to operate on a continuum, so that things that we knew couldn't share or couldn't aggregate, or that would have kind of commercial viability, treating them differently, but all with the same system. And then we worked with regional partners so that every rural community wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. So of our 9 municipalities in Great Country, and of there are 9 within First County as well. Some of our non-agencies that are related to projects, public health, and then labor market planning board. We work together to figure out how we would manage that kind of relationship.
Thanks, Ashleigh. Got a question in the back.
I'm Rob. I'm from City of Barrie, which, while not nearly as remote, I sometimes think you have a probably easier time convincing people from Toronto to go to the Yukon than we do to get people to come up to Barrie and actually work there. approaches has been to say if we can't get the resources and the skills that we need is to develop them. And I wonder if you can talk about if that's been a part of your plan in the Yukon.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, owning your strategy, owning your vision, you have to have that core on your team. But you can't always find all the skill sets you want. We've been, I would say, very successful in hiring for attitude and training for skill. And that does pay off. It's a bit of a longer journey, but I'll tell you, when you get the right person in there, their ramp up is astounding. And even though they might not be quote qualified, months later they're doing it, and the proof's in the pudding. So you do need to monitor and help people not kind of get in over their head, provide the support, and make sure that the safety net is there. But providing the opportunities to try and working to develop that talent is definitely you've got to have that pipeline. Our approach has been to find some senior folks who part of their job is mentoring others who come in who have the right attitude but maybe don't have all the on-the-ground experience, and help them go on that journey in kind of a mentoring advisory capacity. But building your bench strength is absolutely critical, especially when you don't have a ready labor market to go out and just start plucking people off the street.
Ashleigh, I know you've been thinking about capacity as well, so maybe if you want to jump in.
Yeah, my own personal story is a really great example of it. So to give you some background, I started in agricultural science at the University of Guelph. I graduated from international development. I have a master's in public administration, and I spent the first quarter of my career working as a non-technical technologist out of an IT department leading a future-oriented economic development project, right? So none of that's word salad, none of that makes sense. And it all adds up to the fact that a lot of people did exactly what Mark is saying. Now that I had the skills to be able to do this within our community and to charge from our municipality, and gave me the chance to do that. So I think that the capacity issue is really, really important that we try really not and over-credentialize a lot of the projects that are going on. Good idea can come from anywhere, and then it's about investing the resources to do that. Some of our research right now, I think it would be well on the flip side of that, is around how do these the ability to make decisions about our immediate future economic and social development. So if the rural communities that are really preoccupied with how are we going to manage our roads budget, increasing tax rates, and so we have to turn roads back to gravel roads and not maintain them, and close bridges, the questions and the thoughts that are going on are around how are we going to take advantage of investments in green infrastructure or digital transformation. They're just coming to keep the lights on in big chunks of the community. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact when we're downloading a lot of these expectations onto small rural communities, that you may be able to develop capacity, someone like myself, from within the organization, but we may not be, and so how we provide strategies that support those things and recognize that that's the reality of opportunities context. So, twofold situation, recognizing different contexts produce different capacities, but that also not an insurmountable problem. That we can get around that, and we can find ways to support people that can be part of that ecosystem. So it's a systemic and institutional problem, as well as a cultural problem within a lot of organizations.
Thank you. We've had a lot of great conversations here today. I'm sad to have to wrap them up right now. There's so much more going on through the day, but I do encourage you to keep having these conversations. Reach out to Mark, reach out to Ashleigh. These are things that we need to keep in mind as we're building our civic tech movement, our civic tech community, and our digital government communities, because these are voices that aren't often heard, and we need to make sure that we're listening to these voices in order to really build an inclusive, welcoming, and all-encompassing movement. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ashleigh. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.